So I've had a ton of fun this October so far in the lead up to spooky season. I've already put up a ton of Halloween decorations. I flew out to Texas last week to hang out with my buddy Ben of the Dead Ringers podcast, who is a huge horror fan. So naturally, we watched a lot of horror movies, hit some haunted houses, and went out to see Terrifier 3, which is absolutely not for the squeamish. But that's not what today's video is all about. Rather, instead of looking at terrifying games today, we're just going to look at some spooky games that might have the occasional scare, something you can just sort of chill with in the run-up to Halloween. So, all that being said, let's go ahead and kick off this list of 5 different spooky games with one that reviewed fairly well back in the day, but for whatever reason I never got around to it, and I'm sure glad that I chose to play it now because it is a really great time, and that would be Alice Madness Returns. After having been discharged from a psychiatric clinic, a still traumatized Alice now finds herself living in an orphanage along with other unwell children under the care of Dr. Angus Bumby. And in the course of trying to rid herself of the trauma plaguing her and to uncover the truth of her past, she again falls into Wonderland, where a new evil awaits. This game came out back in 2011, and while you might be tempted to think that this wouldn't be too spooky or scary at all, it is deceptively dark, and this is clear right from the jump. Because I thought I was going to get, a cartoonish Tim Burton sort of tale at worst, but Alice's struggle with her mental health is heartbreaking, and seeing it realized in that old vaudeville style of animation is completely unnerving as they try to visually convey Alice's approximation of her own mental state. But it's not all somber. Once you've set out on the adventure and dived full on into the world of Wonderland, at least some lighthearted magic begins to emerge as Alice reconnects with old friends and embarks on her new adventure, within which you'll be mostly engaging with a variety of foes, solving some light puzzles, and platforming your way through some truly wondrous locales, which is completely fitting given the source material. And the more I played, the more I found myself thoroughly enjoying it. The combat is fun as you go to work with the Vorpal Blade up close, or dish out punishment from a distance with the Gatling gun style peppermill. It's pretty standard lock and shock action fare, and while the camera can be finicky at times, particularly when you're surrounded on all sides, it's still a whole lot of fun. When you're not mowing down Wonderland's denizens, there's also some really tight 3D platforming, which is extremely satisfying thanks to being able to repeatedly jump and float, and veering off the beaten path normally rewards Alice with more teeth to upgrade her armaments, so there's a lot of incentive to explore each new area carefully. All of this is set against a brilliant art style that feels like a children's storybook come to life. And I've no doubt this helped inspire the look of similar games in the years that followed, like Little Nightmares. But beyond the visuals, it has top-notch voice acting to flesh out the narrative and the world. Roger Jackson's Cheshire Cat, in particular, is both soothing and sinister as he guides Alice along her return to Wonderland.
Blasted cat. Don't try to bully me. I'm very much on edge.
Perfect. When you're not on edge, you're taking up too much space.
On the Steam Deck performance front, it runs well after you make a few modifications. If you look up the ProtonDB page, you'll find that in order to unlock 60 FPS mode, you'll have to edit a couple of INI files while in desktop mode on your deck. At first I was fine with 30 FPS until I discovered that 60 FPS could be unlocked, but weirdly I was seeing dips down to these single digits for frame rate, and I thought I was crazy after reading so many people praise its performance on the deck. Well, it turns out it was my fault. When you first launch the game on the Steam Deck, it will say, hey, you have a beefier machine and can probably increase the graphics settings. So I did that, but as it turns out I should not have increased the NVIDIA physics value to high because that caused it to crawl pretty bad in portions with multiple enemies or a lot of environmental effects. So yeah, if you fire this up, make sure you keep it at low for the best experience at 30 FPS, and feel free to mod those INI files if you want to be at a nearly steady 60 FPS, save for maybe the occasional drop entering a new area. And it makes me kinda sad that this was the last time Alice had an adventure in Wonderland. I played through the original on PC almost 25 years ago at this point, and I loved it for its style, even if it was a little bit jank, but this feels like an improvement that builds on the original in every arena. Why I never took the time to appreciate the sequel when it first dropped in 2011 is completely beyond me, but hey, better late than never, right? And even if you didn't play the original or have no way to access it since I personally couldn't find it for legal purchase anywhere, you can still enjoy this one, and it's delightfully spooky for the Halloween season. Next up, let's check out something that's still sort of macabre, but a little bit more laid back, and that would be Little Misfortune, a game that my friend Morrow has been on me for years to play at this point, and I'm glad I finally took the leap. Released in 2019, Little Misfortune is an interactive story more than it is a game, and it revolves around Misfortune, a young girl with a questionable home life who sets off on an adventure to find eternal happiness. And while her circumstances can appear pretty grim, she has an endearing optimism about everything in her life, no matter how dour things might seem. And that uneasiness is compounded by the fact that today, Little Misfortune is going to die. We know this because the narrator tells us directly, and as a fun twist on your typical video game narration, he interacts with both Misfortune and you, the player.
Today is the day she will die.
I can hear you, you know.
Oh, you can?
This creates more than a little uneasiness, as we're privy to information that she isn't, and tasked with helping her make decisions that will determine the course of her adventure. Now, that's not a new idea necessarily. Anytime you play a video game and control a character, you inherently understand that you know things that the character doesn't, whether that's their current status or plot points unfolding with other characters. But to have the narrator ping-pong back and forth between addressing you and the character you're controlling makes it a little bit more chilling. But despite a macabre premise, Little Misfortune is outrageously charming. Granted, it's a bittersweet optimism, as a lot of it's rooted in the naivety of being a child, but nonetheless, she constantly makes the best of every situation, even if that situation is horrifying. It's at once uplifting and disheartening, but sustained by an incredible voice performance by Natalia Martinson.
Look, this is my secret hiding spot.
Oh, impressive. But why do you need a hiding spot?
I don't like it when Mommy and Daddy argue too much. And when I come here, I can dream and travel far away.
I see.
She speaks in a Swedish/Chilean accent, which makes sense as the game is set in Sweden, and her sweet musing about everything from her toys to environmental observation is extremely easy to listen to. Speaking of the environment, this is a great fall game overall since it kicks off on October 11th in-game. And the visuals are brilliant with fluid animation and a muted autumn color palette. It's very reminiscent of Over the Garden Wall, but thematically it is a little bit spookier. Where Greg and Wirt appear to narrowly escape dangerous situations, those situations are often revealed to not be quite so dangerous at all after the fact. But it's easy to become super protective of Misfortune, as she seems to always be just a hair's breadth away from, if not directly presented with, incredibly menacing situations. Outside of the presentation, gameplay is mostly walking around, interacting with objects to get Misfortune's thoughts, and solving the occasional puzzle like putting a vase back together. Sometimes you'll also hit decision points that will cause the environment to shift eerily out of phase, and I can't wait to see what sort of impact this is going to have on the story and how the consequences of her actions play out. Steam Deck performance is completely solid, and you shouldn't have to do any tweaks to have a good experience visually. Although I will say that I had to swap the controller positions manually in docked mode, so if you play predominantly in docked mode rather than handheld, you might have to adjust this and reorder the controllers, but beyond that, it's been butter smooth so far. Widespread reception to Little Misfortune has been largely positive, and there's a demo available if you'd like to get in a test run first. But speaking personally, this is exactly the sort of lightly spooky chill game that I love to play in the fall, so if you're a fan of the interactive storybook genre, this one's definitely worth a look. Next up, let's check out a decidedly more sinister game, but one that's short and sweet that you can probably knock out in a half hour or so, and that would be Buckshot Roulette, which was recommended to me by the Scream Deck some months back. The premise of Buckshot Roulette is pretty straightforward. You'll be playing a game of chance with a shotgun. It opens in a seedy nightclub bathroom, and after traipsing your way to a nondescript back room, you'll be taking a seat across from your disturbing opponent. And there you'll take turns aiming a shotgun at your opponent, or yourself, rolling the dice on whether or not you've racked a blank or a live shell. If you pull the trigger on yourself and fire the blank, you'll skip your opponent's next turn. So initially, when you're presented with 1 live shell and 2 blanks, it's a little bit more straightforward to tip the odds in your favor. But as rounds continue, the gameplay gets more complex with items thrown into the mix that can modify how the game continues. Using the knife, for example, will allow you to modify the shotgun into a sawn-off variant that deals 2 damage rather than 1, or if you'd like, you can handcuff your opponent to force them to skip a turn. It all plays out like a really sinister game of rock, paper, scissors, and what really brings it all together is its grimy presentation. Sitting across from a demented-looking opponent while you listen to the faint thump of club music just outside this cramped, dimly lit murder room is twisted good fun as a bite-sized horror game. Naturally, it's a rock-solid performer on the Steam Deck, as you really only cycle through 3 separate locations in between attempts to survive a deadly game. Although I did want to point out that in digging through the options, I love that the developer went for a 90s PC aesthetic for adjusting any options should you feel the need. It's a short experience to be sure, but hey, that's what makes it a great fit for the deck, where quick pick-up-and-play experiences really shine. So if you're the sort that enjoys fatalistic games of chance with a dash of mathematical analysis, or just want a spooky little game of chance to kill some time, Buckshot Roulette is definitely worth the $2.99 asking price. Next up, in sharp contrast to the relative simplicity of Buckshot Roulette, we have Crawl, a nearly too complex for its own good co-opetition-based dungeon crawler for up to 4 players. Now, I'd actually already played this game on the PS4 some years back, but I hadn't revisited it in a while. And checking it out this year, I have to give it props for being one of the most unique arcadey dungeon crawlers I've ever played, which admittedly is kind of a mixed bag. At the outset, you're just a normal hero, exploring the haunted ruins of a foreboding tomb. But as time goes on, and you inevitably meet your untimely end, the game starts to crack open with an avalanche of mechanics. Because once you've died, that's not the end, but rather you become a ghostly spirit. And as a spirit, you can possess traps to impede whoever now has become the hero, or spawn monsters that you can then control to attack the hero. This is a really neat idea because what's effectively happening is that a team of 4 players can continue to progress through the game while passing off between the hero and villain role. All the while, you're leveling up your monsters and the hero to make sure that combat stays competitive and rewarding, since you're always making forward progress as a team, but with some playful competitive play peppered in for good measure. Clearly this is a game that will be best enjoyed with friends, but even solo it can be nice to let the computer control ghosts do their thing while you take a break and let the progress continue. Visually, it's a clear throwback to the earliest eras of gaming, and it has a distinctly Atari/arcadey feel. But it also has some modern polish with really fun, over-the-top voice acting that really punctuates the narrative, and a ton of little explosive effects and graphical flourishes popping off constantly. Almost to the point where it's a little bit difficult to keep track of everything going on screen. It's a really neat idea that's very nearly but not quite too high concept. The moment-to-moment action is fun enough as you start experimenting with the capabilities of different monsters and rushing from one room to the next, but it's also a little bit intimidating as you try to keep track of, again, the absolute mess of action on screen, while also keeping track of the possession, progression, and combat mechanics. I found it best to just sort of roll with it and try not to overthink everything, just keep swinging away, and in time, all of the mechanics will start to click into place as you delve deeper into the dungeon. Steam Deck performance is predictably rock solid, and I didn't have any control difficulties to speak of. So if you're looking for a throwback dungeon crawling adventure that you can enjoy couch co-op style with a few friends this Halloween, Crawl's definitely a fun choice. Granted, I think it would have benefited tremendously from a demo, but nonetheless, it fits the bill if you're down for some spooky hack-and-slash action that offers a unique twist on what would typically be a standard 4-player beat-em-up affair. And finally, let's round this out with one of the few beloved 3D entries from one of gaming's oldest spooky franchises with Castlevania Lords of Shadow. And let me start by saying I could have sworn I already featured this game at one point, but for the life of me I couldn't find any record of it from previous production notes. But I was more than happy to revisit it because there was so much that I'd forgotten about this God of War flavored Castlevania reboot. For starters, while it kicks off with some heavy tutorialization, I didn't mind because along with that came narration from Sir Patrick Stewart, which immediately lends this epic fantasy tale the gravitas it deserves. You'll be playing as Gabriel Belmont, who's on a quest to hunt down an evil order and resurrect his deceased wife, which, man, Konami sure loves sending dudes on missions to look for their dead wives, but I digress. When I called this an epic fantasy tale, I meant it because you can't convince me that the developers didn't take at least a little inspiration from the Lord of the Rings movies when they crafted this. Everything from the in-game tome that keeps track of your skills, narrative, and bestiary, to lush locales filled with fantasy creatures really does paint an interesting take on a Castlevania game. Even the cutscenes like this portion where Gabriel is juxtaposed against a weathered map looks fantastic, and it's great to see the production values on display here, and they hold up incredibly well nearly 2 decades later. On the gameplay front, we have a lot of third-person action that will feel very familiar if you've played any God of War games, and it translates perfectly into the world of Castlevania. Swinging Gabriel's chain whip around feels great, and the movement is fast and fluid. Granted, it does have a few little idiosyncrasies that feel like a product of the era. For instance, it was odd tapping the left trigger to block, and then holding it to initiate a dodge, when games like Bloodborne have conditioned me to dodge with B, or circle for you PlayStation fans. But these are hardly deal breakers, and while some of the design conventions like a true level structure feel a little quaint by modern standards, it doesn't distract from the experience in any major way. What does occasionally get in the way is the camera, which doesn't offer any manual control and can sometimes get obscured by the level geometry. Steam Deck performance is mostly good, hovering between 50 and 60 FPS at default settings, so this one's probably a good candidate for a 40 FPS 40Hz lock, though you might also fiddle with the graphics options a little bit just to see if you can get it closer to that rock solid 60. Personally, I didn't find it to be that jarring, but if you're sensitive to it, then you might need to make some adjustments. Still, overall, this is a really fun action game in its own right, and certainly one of the better attempts at a 3D Castlevania. So if you're looking for a spooky action game rather than a terrifying one, this is definitely worth checking out if you've never had the chance before. Alright, and that's it for this one. Again, not overly terrifying fare or anything like that, just some spooky, goosebumpsy nonsense that you can enjoy on your Steam Deck in the run-up to Halloween. But hey, what about you? Are there any spooky games that you've been checking out recently, or that you would recommend to somebody who doesn't necessarily want to be scared out of their wits? If so, I would love to hear about it in the comments below. As far as what's coming up on the channel, I will be doing a video about, really scary games, probably sometime in the next week or two, hopefully before Halloween hits. And I'm also working on my impressions for Silent Hill 2 Remake, which has just been amazing so far, but I'll save some of that for a deeper dive into it whenever I work on the video. But yeah, for now, as always, thank you so much for your time and hanging out here on the channel. It means a lot to me. Have an amazing day, and I'll see you on the next one.